Thanks, everyone. um, welcome again to the second session. I want to first start out by going do an overview of what we talked about last time, and then we'll get right into learning about Angular scope. So we talked about exactly what Angular was, what's some benefits of using Angular, which is a structural framework for dynamic web apps. It decouples the DOM from JavaScript. It's an MV star type architecture. We can do dependency injection, which we saw when we created controllers, and we'll see some examples later when we're creating services as well. And then we talked about two-way binding between the JavaScript and the DOM. And we talked about, well, we haven't really talked about testability, but that's kind of a good thing for Angular is because you can highly test everything, and that's kind of what we're doing on the project Alex and I are both on. And then we actually set up the plunker there, and then we created a controller, and that was kind of used for the business logic of the application, and then we kind of described it as a constructor function. And then some built-in components that we have is Angular directives, which is a reusable component. We can make custom, it's a custom DOM element. We can also make custom directives that we can make our own. And then it's usually either an attribute or an element. We use an element in our example. And then usually directives, not just the built-in one, are prefixed with some kind of 2 to 3 character long prefix. And then we talked about services, which is an object wired together through dependency injection. And we actually use dependency injection to grab scope and other Angular built-in services. And you can use these to share across to your application. You can use them only when you need them. And it's a singleton, which means that each component gets a reference to that service. Keep on forgetting to go down. So what are Angular filters? We added one, and then we said you shouldn't use them for performance reasons, because our example when we did the search was every key down, it's going to trigger a watch, which is bad on performance. And you can use it for changing format of text, which I haven't really used very much because I just use CSS to do that. And we created our own custom directive. And then we'll see the same code that we worked on last time here soon. And then now we're going to talk about some different kind of scopes that we can use. So here's the types of scopes you can use. Shared is actually default, and we saw that when we added the same directive over and over again. It was sharing the same scope. And then also we have inherited, which means it takes what the parent scope is, and it inherits the child, or the child inherits that scope. And then if you change things, it'll only reflect on the child. If you add things to the child, it'll only reflect on the child. But if you add things to the parent, it'll go down to the child. And there's also isolated, which is the child directive gets its very own scope, and you can actually pass things. You can pass variables and functions, actually strings, to that scope. That way, that scope only worries about what it's going on. Okay, so here's what we left off last time. We were able to search here for some things in our list. We were able to add new things. And then we did that we started off using a controller to do this, and then we eventually moved it into its own directive. And by default, since we're not telling the directive which scope to use, it uses shared scoping. So if I go ahead and first I want to add a new directive that makes this a little better, because right now what I have is this directive is showing everything about the application. So I want to kind of remove that dependency. So I want actually another directive to maintain what's being shown here. So I'll create that directive here. I'm just going to call this the detail directive. I'm going to turn this off so it doesn't keep reloading. Yeah, it'll be in the slides, but as Kevin recommended, is not to do it following along. That way, it's easier to see what's going on, and we'll do something more hands-on later. I'm just going to define the directive down here. What was that? I'm sorry.
Code hinting?
Oh, no. No, unfortunately not, because it's so wide ranged. You can add whatever you want in there, so it's hard to do that kind of thing. So unfortunately, I have to sit here awkwardly and type all this out. And I'll find my controller, and right now I'm just going to leave a blank controller because don't really have anything we need to add to it yet.
So real quick question, what IDE do you personally use and enjoy?
I use IntelliJ at our client site now, but I usually use like Sublime or something simple.
Have you tried brackets?
I've used brackets a little bit. I've used Visual Studio Code a little bit as well. They all have their pros and cons, I think. I've kind of tried to try everything out there to see what I like, and I end up always just falling back to Sublime. Okay, so I have my directive there. I need to add the HTML here. Yeah, I do mind. Is that better? Okay, so I'm going to grab what's inside of here. That way, what I want to do is be able to make this new detail directive. I want that to be in control of what it actually shows. It makes it better. So if we want to reuse this this champions directive that we had, champions app directive that we had made originally, if we want to reuse that, then and maybe we want to display something different. Or actually, sorry, I did that the wrong way. If we want to reuse this detail directive, maybe we want to display it on a different page, we'll be able to just add that directive into the separate page, and we'll be able to reuse that. So I'm going to just grab everything out of here. and then move it into here. And then I'm going to now reference my new directive. Make sure everything looks good. Then it should magically work, but it didn't. So let's see what the problem is. What was wrong with it? Oh, thank you. Okay, there we go. So if I console log here on the scope, we can see what we have available there. Except for I need to inject the scope. And now I should be fine. And let me make that bigger as well. Is that big enough? Okay, I'm actually going to clear the console first and then reload this. That way we can only see how many times it gets console logged. But you can see here that we have the object here that we're finding as the champion. And if I add something new onto my parent directive, actually I'll add something new on my child directive. Should be able to see that here now.
So Brady, when you console.log the scope, what exactly are we seeing?
We should be able to see what the scope of this controller, which would, since we're sharing scope, it should be showing everything on this scope as well. But I think may have did something wrong. So that's what I'm trying to figure out now. Well, you don't really have like a scope public or private in Angular. It should be a shared scope. Is what I should be seeing is that this scope is sharing the scope of the parent.
Another question, like where I'm at right now, our department's broken into two. One department controls a container, all in Angular Node, all that sexy stuff. Another department, all the reporting's in a different language, but it's all contained within an iframe, inside another wrapper. Could I get the scope of the parent wrapper to find out what variables they have if it was on a different domain?
I wouldn't think so, because the JavaScript should be loaded somewhere else, though, because what you're working in is an iframe, right?
Right.
So I don't think you'd be able to get the scope from the container of the iframe, because it's kind of, it's different.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes to see what I'm doing wrong here. So I'm going to add something to my parent scope now. Oh, thank you. Except for its details here. Okay, I'm going to ignore what I have up here for now, or the information inside of here for now. I'm just going to remove this or comment out this stuff. That way we can kind of see a more simple version. So let me change this to a div, and I'm going to say this is from the child scope, and this is from the parent scope. Notice how I added the scope.details variable inside of my child scope, but I also have a reference to it in the parent scope. Because I did a bad job of explaining. In the first place is I put it in the ng repeat there, and I actually expected it to be kind of having the same scope, but it actually kind of surprised me because it was only sending in the champion which variable. So now this should be a shared scope, and I should be able to see all of the things on the parent scope. So that's what I'm demonstrating here is I'm console logging inside of the child scope, and I'm seeing everything that's inside of the parent scope. So you see we have the add function that we added the last session, and then we have the whole champions array of champions. Then we also have the show ranking function that I made and the rest of the things we created last session.
Dumb question. Does console log eat up resources?
Um,
Because I use it all over the place and I dump everything.
yeah.
And all the guys on my team are like, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it.
It's better to use some kind of logger because from my understanding is that console log is not asynchronous. So if you get some kind of error or something like that, it's going to stop the rest of the application from running. So I think could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
The question was about using console log inside of production environment if it's going to have some kind of error, or if it's bad using it.
Right. Yeah. My comment was that I create a function called console log, and I kind of put a console.log inside that function, comment at that line, or have like a parameter for your environment, like a production environment. It just won't execute anything inside that function, and in your development environment it will. So that way you can leave all your console logs in for your development instead of like deleting them all out. The other thing you can do is, as part of my build process, I kind of pull out comments. So
I wrap stuff in URL variables, so if I add, URL dbg equals 1, then all the console log dumps for development purposes. No one's going to know that URL variable's there. And if it's not present, nothing dumps, but my guys still say it slows down page loads.
So in Angular, there's a logger service that kind of gets that you can turn off and on in production environment, and I think it's also asynchronous. I haven't really used it myself, but that's what I've heard is people using it as a way of getting away from using console log. Okay, so now we see that we should have every property on the parent scope since it's using a shared scope. Now if I change this to I want to change my details directive to using inherited scope, we can kind of demonstrate and see the difference between it. And all I have to do here is make it the scope equal to true, and now it should be an inherited scope. And you see that the function or the variable that I created earlier is no longer working inside of the parent scope. Since it's not sharing, it's only getting a copy of or a reference to the parent scope in the child scope. So if I create a new variable here, it's not going to show up in the parent scope at all. Any questions on?
Why would you do that?
That way you only need what's in the parent, and say you have some variable that you need inside of the child, but the parent doesn't really care about it. It's a little more performant to use inherited scope, or it's just better to. Well, it's better to just keep it localized to what you need, rather than getting everything from the parent.
So basically, what you did is you set scope to true. You said that makes the scope inheritable, or it's so.
It makes the scope inherited. So I grab everything from the parent, and I can use it inside of my child. But if I change anything in the child directive, it doesn't reflect the same way as the parent.
Okay, so whatever you put in scope.details, if you did it dynamically on the page, say you had like an input box and that changed it, it wouldn't reflect.
Yeah, it wouldn't reflect in the parent.
Okay.
Good question. Any other questions on these two different scopes? Because the next one's a little bit different. Okay, cool. So now I want to use a isolated scope, which is where the first thing that I was working on is going to end up. So if I want to use an isolated scope, I actually have to make it equal to an object, and then inside of this object I can have new variables. And here I'm just going to pass in the champion that this directive is going to be concentrated on. And then I'm going to uncomment this stuff. I'm going to keep the details there. That way we can kind of see what happens to it. Not sure why it's not actually commenting out everything. Yep. Come on, Plunker. Better than that. Okay. So I'm going to move this directive up one line or two lines. So it's in the ng repeat now. And then the way you use the isolated scope is I have to actually say that I have a new variable and I'm going to pass it into the child directive. And I badly named this, so I'm going to actually rename it and just call it foo. And then inside of here, I'm going to rename this also to foo. And unfortunately, you have to change it everywhere. So actually inside of here, okay, so now it should magically work. And we see the new scope. Actually, I'm going to clear this first and then refresh. Then we'll be able to see the new scope it gets. And you see here we have details that's the local variable we recreated inside of the child scope. And then we should have only the champion that's in the child scope. So here we have one at the bottom, and we only have the ID, the ranking, and the name of the champion. And then we have this child scope, or the child scope do the things details 5 times because of the way, because this is getting repeated 5 times.
Shouldn't it be object 4?
Can you ask a question on there? Thank you.
Shouldn't it be object 4 since there are only 5 elements?
Well, the ID I kind of created as 1, and then I didn't do that starting with 0. Yeah. So to clean this up, I'm going to remove that. Actually, before I do that, you can see that the child scope does have that locally created variable, and then the parent scope does not have it. Just like the inherited scope. Remove that from there, then remove. Yeah, this is the isolated scope. You remove this so it's easier to see. And notice how the ranking isn't showing up. It's because that function is in the parent scope right now. So I'm going to actually move that into the child scope. There we go. That was weird. So now it works again, and we should still be able to add things here. And then we see the function that's controlling, showing this rank is still working correctly. Remove that since we're not using it anymore. And you can also, there's also other ways or other things you can do with the isolated scope here. If you wanted to pass in a function, you would use the ampersand, and that would pass in a reference to a function. So if you wanted the parent directive to control what's actually happening on one of these child directives, you could pass in the function there. You can also do a string by using the @ sign, and that passes just the string literal in there. So you wouldn't be able to, it wouldn't update on either side. And what we used here for the equal sign is a 2-way binding. That means that if I change anything on the child scope, it will reflect the parent scope. So if I would have came in here and I changed the name of this one of these people, which I can demonstrate, by doing scope dot foo. I'm going to remove this foo function because we don't need it. But if I came in here and I said, okay, I want everybody's name to be myself, except for it needs to be name. There we go. Now, I just rank myself from 1 to 5, and it reflects both the child and the parent scope. Even though I changed it on the child scope, you see that it's getting updated. Also, if I would move this into here, and just give this an array index, that should reflect one of those, except for it's not foo anymore. Any questions on the different kind of scopes? Also, there's one more way you can pass in things to the child scope, and you can use this is a one-way binding. This is new as of Angular 1.5.0. This is a way to be more performant because now we're passing in this this variable, and if I change it on the child scope, it shouldn't reflect anything on the parent scope. It just makes it more performant, saying it doesn't create a watcher on the parent to see if anything changes. So if I change something here, and I output the champion name on the parent scope, should see that it's not getting updated, but I think there's some weirdness with that one because I haven't really played around with it too much, but it does make it so it's more performant. So if you update something on the parent or on the child scope, it shouldn't reflect the parent scope because it's not. It doesn't have that watcher there. So next, what we're going to be using is the Angular HTTP service, which is the only other service we've really seen so far is the $sign scope. And we'll be able to inject the $sign HTTP in here. And this is usually used for to get some kind of server data. So if you need to do you can do like an HTTP post, a GET, but the other kind of RESTful kind of way of getting data. So inside of my parent directive, I'm going to inject the $sign HTTP. And then actually I won't need this anymore because we're going to get this from the server. And let me grab the URL. And then Angular has shorthands for some of the regular HTTP or GET or HTTP or RESTful interface. So I can do get on the URL that I'm giving. And then here we're going to use a callback and get the response from that. Question?
Do. So how do you deal with cross origin?
Cross origin?
Yeah, with Angular. Because I know with jQuery, you have to set I think it's the data type, well, when you have your get function. So how do you deal with that in Angular? Is it different?
So usually that is handled on the server end.
On the
so
server end, okay.
Server has to enable cross domain,
Right.
because the browser is not going the browser is not going to allow it.
Yeah. So I guess if you were on a project, that would have been taken care of prior.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've ran into that problem before. It's weird. I was working on an API, or I was working on a demo with an API, and it didn't have cross origin. So I kind of used a local proxy, to kind of get around that.
Yeah.
Which is bad, but I mean, it's funny that they're like, oh, this open API, but you can't do a cross origin. Like, I can't even use this thing. Oh, okay. I can provide that, but it's really long. Yeah, that's fine. No problem. So let me go back to my cheat sheet, because I have, they actually didn't make it very easy to grab their data, because instead of, they had properties for each thing instead of an array. So I had to kind of convert that over. So just add that here. And I did something wrong. Missing semicolon. Oh, I see what I'm missing. You have to actually make it a inline function. So, so I'm grabbing it's just the way the data is here is in the resolve, or the response. It's just .data, and then I had to make that function to convert that over. So now we should have a lot more information there. And then we have the names, and so let me go in here, and I'm going to change this, because there's not going to be a ranking anymore. And then I'm going to use span, and then there's description. Yeah, that's the long text. Let's do description or title. Don't really need the ID anymore. And I go back to my cheat sheet, because they actually have an image now. And change this to foo. There we go. Should have our champions. Should still be able to search. And then even though you don't really need to add any now, that should still add it to the bottom, I think. No, it's not. It's not saving it to server at all. I just, at this point, you don't even really need the add there because unless you're an admin of their actual site, you're not going to be adding anything to it. Yeah. Yep. Of course, in a real world application, you'd have a lot more going on here. You'd have the post, you'd have the put and delete kind of things here, but for simplicity's sake, I just use the http.get on one of these things here. Any questions on the HTTP? Oh.
Sorry about that. So basically, you're just making a request, and then what information you get, you'll just use whatever you can use with Angular to basically have it displayed on the page.
Yep. And I kind of copied and pasted here because I already knew what was coming in. But what I did to actually get this information was I just looked into the console, put a breakpoint in here, and we can see what's in there. So if I go and put a breakpoint in here, it'll actually let me save this and refresh. Sometimes Plunker is kind of weird about when you try to put breakpoints inside of your functions. Oh. I'm not sure what you mean. Like,
We have problems with departments grabbing our data, consuming it, creating their own reports on it. If we started, sticking a bunch of stuff out into, arrays out there that we use for the services, is there a way to see if someone else is using it?
well, I think that would be more of on the server end than on the client side, because the client really it's the one grabbing the data, so it doesn't really have control over who's looking at the data. Okay, so there we go. Let me put a breakpoint in when we're loading the data. That way we can kind of see what the data looks like coming in. If I can put it in the right spot. There we go. So this is kind of what I did is I kind of went in here and saw what the data looked like, and then I based it off of that. But you see how everything's an object, nothing's an array. That's why I had to do that object to array conversion there. Well, you can see some of the information that's in here. And also, you can do error handling with this as well. So here we're grabbing the response. But if you, in the second argument, you can say function error, and then you can do your error handling that way. Show something on the screen, or whatever you need to do. And I don't really have a good way of demonstrating that since it's not my API. So if like the server goes down and you try to request some kind of data, then you'll get into this block of code. Any questions on the HTTP service?
if you just put a mistake in your URL, will that error fire then?
Good question. Let's see. I'll just put a breakpoint in there before I change it. Oh, there we go. Yep. So now we can see what we have there. But of course, you'd have you'd show the error message somehow in there. If you had a actual server, if you actually hit the server and it returned some kind of error, you could handle it here and show the error that way.
So error is a built-in function.
Well, it's still the $HTTP service. It's just the second argument to the callback here is the error handling. So here we're saying dot then, and then this is the actual success, and then the second parameter to that is the error. If you get an error, change this back, and then it should work again. And then the better approach to this is, see how we have all this code inside of our controller and we're getting data, is to use a custom Angular service, which brings us to our next plunker, or our next demonstration. We've already kind of defined what a service is, so I don't really have a description there, but you've seen that we've used them now as the HTTP service and the scope service. So inside of here, I'm going to create my new service. It is kind of confusing because they call it a factory. Yep, thank you. Go one more if that's big enough. I get a little cluttered though. Try to move this over. So just like we did the directives, we're actually going to make this equal to a object. We're going to return an object, and here I'm just going to make this a, if I can spell it right, and I'm just going to use an inline function here, and then inject the $HTTP service here. And inside of this function, we're going to just grab this information. And we don't need the HTTP service in this controller anymore. Just going to paste this in here and move some things around. I actually want the URL up here so we can, if we wanted to reuse it, you could change the URL slightly for each different kind of request if you wanted to save champions or other things like that inside of here. Okay, where's this end? Here we're going to do something slightly different as well. So I'm going to remove this whole block, and I'm just going to return this object, this promise. And then inside of my champions directive, I'm going to paste this back in. And this is just my function. So before I do that, I want to inject my new service. If I can spell it right. And then inside of here, I can do now it should magically work. Or I misspelled something. I think it was just champions. Yep. This is just the reference to the function, which is here. Turn this to function. And here. Yes, thank you. It doesn't help if we're not calling a function. There we go. And now it magically works again. Of course, you can also put other functions in here. Services can get really lengthy and other things that it does. The reason being is we can reuse this across the app now. If we need to grab champions on a different page, we can easily do that using this service. And we just do a similar thing as on a different page, we can just call the same service the same way, and maybe we want to display it differently, or even change the URL slightly if we need to save them or something like that. Any questions on the service? It's pretty simple of how to create it, and then you can create your functions as well. Here we just kind of created one as an example, but of course it can get lengthy and more complicated.
I had a question, but it's a little bit kind of on a tangent. It's the promises that you used.
Mm-hmm.
So I know in the past, and when I tried using promises, sometimes it just returns the promise object, and that's it. It doesn't really give me the data. So how is it that it's able to pull the values from that promise object?
Yeah, let me just put a breakpoint in here, and we can kind of see what's going on there. So similar to how we did it before we moved it into a service, here we're just returning the promise, and then on the promise is where we can call the callback here. Okay. So let me inspect that. There we go. And we can kind of see what the promise looks like before we run the .then. You can also do, in Angular, you can do explicit promises and resolve and reject that. But this is a lot simpler, and you only really use the explicit promises in different kind of edge cases where maybe you need to be in more control of what's going on with the promise. Here we're just going to use the regular callbacks.
Because that was probably my biggest problem with promises. It's figuring out how to, because I think with promises, you have to do something to the values for it to actually be returned. If you don't do anything, it's pending. So
Yeah, it just depends on, Angular makes it really simple to do that. I think in jQuery there's something similar as well,
there
or
is.
Jax.
Yeah.
So let me see here. And everything's so big. Let me try to small. There we go. If we just do this, we should be able to see what's all available in the service. Of course, we only have one thing, but you can see that it's a function there. And if we do get champions, should be able to see what the actual function is. We call that, should be able to see this is the promise with the error and success. And then we can do the dot then on that. It's not really going to do anything until you do this. And we should be able to see a similar thing to before. Maybe. Maybe not. But we're able to demonstrate it here in, inside of line 47. Should be able to see what we're getting back from there, which should be the same thing as before. Yep. Oh, sorry. Am I in the way? Any questions on the custom service we wrote? Yep. And it's a way to communicate kind of between the different controllers as well. You can grab data from there. Yeah. Okay. We have one more slide to go through, and then we'll get into something else. So I think one of the original questions was increasing performance. So this is kind of some tips that I've heard. Angular and some new things like the one-way binding on isolated scopes. And also I got to show you the power of filters, and I stripped it away from you and said not to use it anymore because it's not performant. You can also do one-time binding on expressions. So if you know those expressions are not going to change on either the child or parent scope, you can use : and then the variable name, and then it'll only get loaded into the DOM once, and then it's not going to create a watcher that's waiting for something to change. And then also, if you can, I know it's really hard, but if you have something small and you can make it static, it's better to do that than using ngRepeat. Also, if you can get around not using isolated scope, using shared or inherited scope, you can do that to increase performance as well. And also, you can use ngIf for instead of ngShow or hide, because ngIf doesn't add more watchers because it's between the DOM and the JavaScript, because with ngShow and hide, it's just using display none CSS property, whereas ngIf is only creating the DOM if that statement is true. Yes.
So, can you show us an example of how to do the same function? Then you're rewriting the function.
Well, the question is there a good example of avoiding using ng repeat? But yeah, ng repeat is kind of one of those cases like it'd be really easy to use, or you do use it all over the place. It's kind of hard to avoid it. But if you have some kind of short list of things that is static, say you have, can't think of a good example, but
Just hard
yeah, just hard coded in there. If it's something very simple and maybe 3 or 4 lines of HTML, it'd be better to just hard code the HTML in there instead of using ng repeat, because ng repeat can be abused on something that's really simple and small, and it would make it non-performant if you used ng repeat, or less performant. Not really, depends on the rest of the page, but it can get, because you can use ng repeat with just let me show you real quick. You could use an ng repeat just on something really simple. So let me just go in here, and that's a bad place to put it. Let me go in here and comment out this ng repeat. Because you could do something like that. It's very simple, and it makes it easier to just put it in here and then reference that inside of the ng repeat. But this could also easily be used as a static thing instead of using ng repeat. Of course, you wouldn't. Really, this isn't a good use case, but of using ng repeat, because you're just doing 1 through 4. But that's kind of an example of this is so simple. You might as well just put it as a static HTML instead of using the ng repeat. That's kind of an extreme bad case, but you could see where something like this could happen.
In 2, do they kill ng repeat? Is there a different function that's...
No, ng repeat is still there in 2. One thing they got rid of though is these filters, because that was badly performed, or bad performance, because the filter we used was the search, or just a regular filter, and you can search the whole ng repeat. So that was bad performance, but ng repeat is still there because it's really powerful. But you may not be able to avoid it that much. But if you see a case where like it looks really simple to just use it statically, then you can move it over to static instead of using ng repeat.
So those are basically just the fundamental building blocks with Angular. Is there any other features or services that it's a little bit more complex, or that's it?
For Angular in general.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of concepts that we won't be able to get to today. And you asked about resources. I think one of the questions in the email was about resources as well, and that's actually my last slide. So I have some good resources here. If you have a Pluralsight account, this guy is really good. I went through some of his tutorials. Best practices was really good. There's also this John Papa style guide, which I think gets to the question about how do you know bad Angular versus good Angular. And this is a really good guide, and we follow some of that in our current project. Also, if you, I haven't really read the original NG book, but I've read a lot of the NG2 book, and it was really good. So I suggest using that one. or reading that one. And then there's also, this is just an article about explaining Angular scopes. And then references for some definitions was on the Angular website.
Just in case anyone doesn't know, Columbus Library now offers all Lynda courses for free if you have a library card, if you just go through their resources section online. And that's a pretty cool free.
Nice. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it just happened like a month ago.
Cool. If there's any other questions on how to make Angular more performant? And yeah. Oh, I'll share the slides with everyone at the end. Then we can take a break and then jump into some hands-on.